So let's start. Good morning, everyone. This is the second webinar we offer from Beyond the Urban. I think that one of the main concerns of our network is behavior, changing behavior, and how can we, make like this cultural change needed to put the people in the public transport or in sustainable ways of moving, active mobility, and make a step forward. So today we have here Brian Marrinan, that's gonna go deep in these issues. And so I'm not taking it longer. Please, Brian, take the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Monica, and thank you all for spending a little bit of time with me. I think I met many of you in BIC last year, and then there's several new faces here as well. So for those who I haven't met, I'll briefly introduce myself. So I work in an organization called Journey Partners. We focus on the sustainability of transport and travel. My own background is an interesting mix of technology. That was my undergrad, but I very rapidly got more interested in the psychology and the people side of things. And studied psychology, studied to be a coach, studied social science, and have really focused in on kind of behavioral science over the last several years and how it applies to the wider transportation and mobility ecosystem, with a particular focus on sustainability and how do we create opportunities for people to make more sustainable choices in their day-to-day lives. So today I'm going to hopefully give a little bit of background to what might be useful to understand in this space. It's not going to be an incredibly deep dive, but we are going to understand the key principles behind behavioral science and nudging. And then we are going to talk about some kind of practical examples that I think are pretty cool of other places around the world that have tried some things in this space. And then we're going to actually try and build some nudges of our own to solve particular issues that we might be facing at the moment. I will say this meeting is being recorded, but anything you do or say in your meeting rooms will not be recorded. So you can talk about whatever challenges you're facing that you might want to deal with. That's not going to be part of the recording afterwards. It's only what's said in this room that's recorded, and that will be shared with you afterwards. So in that context, I might share some slides with you and kick off. So we are looking at moving people, because that's the core to what we're all about. And we're going to look at how we use science to nudge behaviors in transport and mobility today. I'm going to kick off with a question to you immediately. And that is, what... Do I have to go onto my other screen? I do. When I say transportation systems, what is the first thing that comes into your mind? I want you to throw it into the chat. So I say transportation systems. Put down 1, 2, 3, 4 words into the chat about what's the first thing that comes to mind. Okay, those are starting to flood in now. So infrastructure and vehicles, public transport, flexible mobility of people, mobility, buses, railways, bicycles, network structures, different transport modes, coordination, transport services and infrastructure. None of these are surprising. I think that's what most people think about. You say transportation systems, they have images pop up into their head of buses and trains and airplanes and all that kind of thing. And this is the way that transport has been built for a long time. But the challenge is, the key of transport is how do we get people from A to B? And it should be all about people movement rather than the thing that's doing the movement when we talk about transportation systems. When I put transportation systems into Google Images, there is one photo that has a person on it. Even when there's all these cool new AI generated photos that are popping up on Google Images, they're still just showing buses and trains and planes and all that kind of stuff, but no people in the mix. So what we're going to be looking at today is that people side of things and really digging into what that means in terms of how we look at our infrastructure and our systems and how we include people at the heart of what we do. So, next question into the chat. Who is this and what is the trait that he was best known for? I think the first person has it immediately. It is Spock from Star Trek. And rationality and logic was basically everything around him. It was always, this is the logical choice. The logical choice is to kill 100 people to save 1,000. Those kind of things came up regularly for his character. So that's absolutely it. And in a way, Spock kind of represents how we've been looking at transportation systems for quite a while. For several decades now, we have been looking at the transport decision makers have been looking at how we pursue technological advances, how we diversify urban transport services, and we have not been giving much consideration to how passengers actually behave. So transport providers kind of assume that passengers are strictly rational, strictly logical, and when it comes to their daily commutes, the majority of transport systems are built on the idea that people base their travel decisions on journey time and cost. And what we have started to learn increasingly recently is that there are a hell of a lot more factors that go into these decisions, or lack of decisions, than we ever thought before. So there are some people that include more factors. There are other people that make significantly less choice and don't take decisions about how they perform their daily commute, but also perform all these other transportation elements and mobility elements around their lives. So in that context, we have, as humans, we are creatures of habit. So we tend to set a habit and stick to it, particularly when it comes to a daily commute. I think one of the more interesting examples of this was the Olympics in London, where they were doing quite a bit of work on the development of the underground system in preparation for transporting lots of people who were coming together for the Olympics. And so they asked locals in London to switch their commutes at different stages because they had to close certain stations, they had to close certain lines, but also they wanted to prepare for the mass influx of people for the Olympics itself, and therefore wanted people to change their regular commute a little bit. What's interesting is that forced people to look at new options around how they do their commute. And London Underground have looked at the data since and realized that 13% of people who switched their commute then have stuck with their new commute. So they dropped their old one, that habit, because they've either found a new habit and have just stuck with that, or they actually found a much more efficient way to get to work because they were forced to out of necessity during that period. So it's quite interesting how we really stick into these habits. Psychology would tell us it takes roughly 21 days to form a new habit, and then it's harder to break out of it. But if you create a new habit, maintain it for 21 days, you're much more likely to stick to it then as well. So there's two ways of looking at that. We have to break one, but also we can create new ones in a relatively short period of time. We're quite emotional. So we make decisions based on a range of different factors that are just purely down to our emotions and not rationality. We are prone to taking shortcuts. If we feel that there's an easier option out there, we are much more likely to take that option. I'll go into this a little bit more in depth later on. We are dictated to by our environment, so it has a much more significant impact on us than we think when it comes to decision making. And we are driven by social norms and our own self-image in a way that we don't even realize. And again, I will touch on this later on when we go into a little bit more depth. So given all this, nudges have come into fashion over the past few years. A book was written by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in 2008, or released in 2008, called Nudge. And nudge, by their definition, is any aspect of choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. That's a really technical way of saying it reframes people's thinking around their decisions. It gets them to move in a direction that you want them to move to without them necessarily even realizing that they're making a decision that has been pre-framed for them differently than it may have been before. So nudging is all about encouraging people in the direction that you want them to go in terms of the decisions that they take. Now, nudges can be good or bad, and that's why it's interesting that there is still some controversy around this. David Cameron set up a nudge unit in the UK, and very quickly it became the butt of jokes. It became a signal that David Cameron was trying to monopolize people and change people's behaviors in the way that he saw fit. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think if we look at kind of a libertarian to a paternalistic spectrum, where I guess some people would sit on the just inform me and then have no involvement in my decisions. That's just the information provision side. On the other side, we have a very paternalistic, where we're actually looking at banning certain activities. I think it is much more on the libertarian side, where we're encouraging behaviors, but not actually restricting anything, versus the other side. And there's another reason why I think it's important in that I might ask a question actually to present this to anyone. Has anyone recently bought a new car?
No.
Antonio?
No.
No.
No? Within
No.
the past kind of 2-3 years?
No.
No one.
I did. I think, yeah, in the past 3 years, yeah, I did.
In the past 3 years then, okay. Can I ask, what car was it?
It's Clio.
A Clio, okay. So Why did you pick a Clio as opposed to a Mercedes, for example?
Well, part of price.
Okay.
Also,
yeah.
because
Rationality came in. Okay.
rationality. Yeah, just not what I needed. Also,
Right. And why then a Clio as opposed to maybe a Skoda, which would be cheaper than a Clio?
this one was available at the car shop. Also,
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. What color is it?
gray.
Gray. Do you like the color gray?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. When you drive around in that and you see people seeing you drive in it, what do you think a Clio says about you?
Good question. I think it's kind of a mainstream car. So not like very special or like quite mainstream. So
Gotcha. Did you buy it new or secondhand?
secondhand.
Secondhand. What was it like the first time you sat into the car?
Very
You
nice.
remember that feeling?
Yeah,
What's
very
that?
good.
Very nice.
Yeah.
You were excited?
Yeah.
Okay. Did it have a bit of the new car smell?
Yeah, it did.
It did. Yeah, we all have
Freshly
that feeling.
cleaned.
Okay. Okay. Who is particularly proud of their car? Is there anyone who like kind of treats their car very special, washes it regularly, really likes their car?
There were some typings in the message board, so
In the
perhaps
chat there?
Yeah.
Okay, let me pull that up. A Ford Focus from Germany? Why would you get a Ford Focus from Germany? Why not a German car from Germany? I like it though. A Nissan Leaf 100% electric. Actually, so that's interesting. Tanya, why an electric car? You can turn off the mic and hop on the chat if you want. Or maybe your mic isn't working. Okay, yeah, no, maybe Tanya's stepped away for a minute. Because again, anyone who buys an electric car at the moment, it's making a statement about them. And I guess where I'm going with this is these guys have been using nudge techniques for a long time with us. When we think about how cars are built, how they are branded, everything about them is being thought about from the manufacturer's perspective. And I don't think we do the same thing when it comes to public transportation and mobility systems. The whole infrastructure around the motor vehicle industry is minute. I've put in this headline here because Nissan actually have a team of people. So the new car smell, anyone who's into their cars will know that it actually came from a range of the different chemicals that were used in the car. That's the toxins that were released. That's what the new car smell was. And then several years ago, the health agency in Australia did a report about basically how bad the new car smell is for people when they buy a car, because it is actually just breathing in toxins. So all the car manufacturers started to try and reduce those toxins, but then had to create a new car scent. So Nissan actually hired a team of nasal specialists to create this new scent for their car so that people would feel just as happy getting into the new car. So it's pretty fascinating. You can now get different sprays and all that kind of stuff that kind of replicate it as well. So these people have been thinking about this for a long time. They think about the brand that they're positioning to you, what they feel that then communicates to you, or to you and about you to the people who see you drive it. And there's a significant amount of thought goes in on their side from that perspective. There's been research done in the US about basically how pride people feel to their cars, because it attributes social status to each individual that is in a car, right? So you're either, your social status might be, I'm an EV driver and I'm conscious of the environment, and that's the message I want to communicate to people and myself. What we're also seeing is that the more people feel of themselves in their car, the more pride they have in that ownership, the more often they use that vehicle, and the more they get frustrated by anything that is anti-car. So if we're encouraging public transportation as a more common use for commuting, for other activities in our lives, there is a little bit of kind of pushback in terms of, well, we're actually discouraging car use at the same time. And so we will expect some pushback in some of those decisions that we're taking. I think a lot of people have seen it around Europe now when we're putting in more bike lanes, and there's kind of people complaining that we're taking up too much of the road with these bike lanes and they're not being used enough and all of these kind of things. So it is, it's something interesting from that perspective that we need to keep in the back of our heads, because you're in essence trying to derobe, to strip something of they're very proud of, that have invested significantly in, they feel a personal connection with. And so that's something to keep in your mind, that the car companies have really been drilling into people for a long, long time. So what we want to do is try and create emotional connections in the other direction that fit and create new images of success for people. Tanya, I'm just seeing you're putting in a comment there, because where I live, it makes sense. Every day I go from 600 meters down to 5. Okay, so you're really up high. You go down to recharge, the braking system's different. Absolutely, okay. So it makes sense there on your EV front. So there's a real practical angle, as well as perhaps some other elements in that. Fantastic. So in that context, I am going to talk now about some of the key principles of behavioral science and how they relate to nudging. And I've tried to boil this down to some of the very key elements of what we oh, that's fine, Tanya, that's no problem. So the very key elements of what we'll need to know. I'm then going to give some examples, and then I'm going to maybe talk a little bit about how we'd actually create a nudge before we go do it ourselves. So this is probably just some of the baseline core information that you need in the background to understand the space. So one of the key areas of behavioral science is decision-making processes. And there's typically kind of 3 basic elements to this. So you have rational choice theory, which we've spoken about. That's the Spock in ourselves, that we make decisions by optimizing utility based on the available information and preferences. So we make the best possible decision based on the information that we have and what we like or dislike about that. Bounded rationality then is slightly different, and it's a decision-making which is limited by cognitive limitations at the time available to make the decision. So we have a certain amount of information, but we have a limited amount of time to take a decision on what we're going to do with that information. And so that kind of binding is something that we create shortcuts in our brain around to say, if I have a certain amount of information and I have a certain time frame, then this is probably the process that I will quickly go through to make the best decision for me. And a lot of that goes by what we would call gut feeling, and probably less of a detailed breakdown of the information in front of us. And then the last kind of theory in this area is Daniel Kahneman's book a few years ago that you might have heard of. Daniel's he, bless him, passed away last year, an Israeli economist. And he came up with this idea of that there were two systems going on in our brain. System 1, which was this gut feeling purely, and system 2, which was very deliberative process. And he had a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which was a huge bestseller. And I think he was kind of encouraging us to take some time every so often to really analyze our decision-making process and think about whether our gut decisions were leading us in the right direction, and how we could streamline some of those decision-making processes over time. Couple of comments have come in there. Ford Focus, okay, we're still in the car. I probably shouldn't have gone that route. And then, are these different principles or competing theories? No. So they're just all different principles of how we come to different decisions. And I think at different points in time, we use different elements of them. Becoming more conscious of what we personally use is an advantage to us, because we start to understand, when it comes to decision making, here's my natural process, and here's maybe a part of the other element that I need to bring into this. But we also need to understand that here's how other people make decisions in the context of their day-to-day behaviors. So they're not conflicting, they're complementary, but we need to understand them all in terms of how we create interventions that support multiple different ways of thinking. The next thing I wanted to talk about is maybe applying this Rock's scarf motivational side of things. So what motivates us in different direction? And so the scarf is status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And he would say that these are the 5 key factors that motivate us to do different things, that inspire us to take different decisions. So status, I've tried to bring this into a transportation element. Status might be the cars that we're talking about. It might be a more comfortable train. It might be a more scenic view along the way. It might be the premium cabin within the train, those kind of elements. I know in the US, for example, when you tell them that you've taken Amtrak, they look at you in horror, because that's kind of where people who take drugs go to take drugs while mobile. And that's kind of the perception in the US. Why would you do that when you can rent a car? So it's interesting from that perspective what it means in that market versus somewhere else. Certainty, the reliability and trustworthiness of the transportation method that you use. The autonomy, how easily can you get around the location that you're looking to go to? So we're all about urban, rural. I think a good proportion of urban transport systems probably can get you around relatively autonomously, but that's certainly not the case when you get to rural areas. So you have to think about, how do we create more of that if you're coming up with solutions for that market? Relatedness, that's a sense of connection with the people around you. There are some interesting examples of how some public transportation systems have actually tried to create like networking carriages. Here in Ireland, if there's a conference in Dublin and people are coming from around the country to it, the train company sets up a conference carriage, and you go in and you meet all the other people who are going to that conference, and you get to meet them and engage with them ever before you get to the conference. So there's different things that are setting up to kind of try and engage people and get a community feel to it. And then fairness is typically around, do you feel that you're paying a fair amount for that transportation, that it fits with your budget and what value you're getting in return? So these are the motivational factors. In terms of switch screen, a couple of environmental and contextual factors. We talked about the environment affecting us more than we ever even realize. And you will have typically default effects where people are more likely to choose the default option. This you'll often find in terms of opt-in versus opt-out. People are much more inclined to go along with something when it's opt-out as opposed to opt-in. So they're not going to tick the box to opt into a pension, for example. But if they actually have to physically opt out of that pension, they're much less likely to do that. So countries internationally now are switching to this mode of you actually have to tell someone you do not want to be in the pension plan rather than the other way around, which is how it was for decades beforehand. And then the other thing is framing effects. It's how the information is presented to you to encourage certain decisions. So you're given contextualized information that I guess would, in the way it's presented, make you feel like this is the correct choice for you. Now, these are both techniques that have been used in sales and marketing for years. So it's only now that we're kind of catching up on this mode of understanding how we can, I'm not going to say manipulate an environment, but certainly structure an environment so that we can help people to make what we feel are better decisions coming from a place of good. Beyond that, I want to talk a little bit more about that environment piece, because I think in mobility and transport, it's hugely important. And I've come across this cartoon a few years ago, and I think it's just highly relevant. Because you have these people waiting for a lift in a building, and they're just complaining that the elevator is too slow. And they immediately go into solution mode, which is we can do things like upgrade the algorithm that runs the lift so that it goes faster, just make it faster, replace the lift with the faster version, install a stronger motor. So it's all about speed because they're waiting too long. What could be the other potential solution here? How could we reframe this problem differently to create a less obvious set of solutions? So they're all waiting for the lift. It's too slow. What does that actually mean? If you say something is too slow, what does that say about how you are feeling?
You are nervous, maybe?
Yeah. Nervous. What else could link to that? If something isn't happening fast enough and we're expecting it, what happens in that gap? You feel you're losing time? Absolutely. Anxiety, frustration, upset. If any of you have kids, what happens to kids when they can't do anything for about 30 seconds? Boredom kicks in. They cry. Oh God, are you at that stage, Alessia? You poor thing. Yeah, boredom kicks in, and it kicks in for adults just as much. So another way of reframing this potentially is thinking about the wait being annoying. It's not actually that the elevator isn't fast enough. It's just, I don't like this wait. So that becomes the problem you need to solve, as opposed to making the elevator faster. Because if the elevator still has to stop on 20 floors on the way up to you, it's still, no matter how fast it goes, it's only going to add a few seconds because it has to stop on all these other floors. But if we can make the wait more entertaining by putting in some music and putting in mirrors where you can preen yourself and look at how pretty you are, those kind of things will make the wait seem less burdensome. Time is a big factor, I think, in transportation, and I think it's one of the most misunderstood areas. This comes from Brussels Airport. And Brussels Airport decided to do an art exhibition where they brought Rubens paintings into one of the waiting areas within the airport, which is pretty spectacular. But what they did with it was even more entertaining. So Rubens, for anyone who isn't familiar, is really famous for painting cherubs, these little boys that have wings and shoot arrows and all that kind of stuff. And he would have done them in an awful lot of his paintings. So they put in a digital display that matched with the artwork, which made one of the cherubs jump out of one of the paintings and then went on a dance, walked across the top of the paintings. It was all digitally projected onto the wall, but created this fascinating thing that just kept everyone entertained. So again, in an airport, they're probably waiting for a flight and getting bored, but they reframed this to create an entertainment piece that actually made them like the airport more and talk about the airport and how good it was, as opposed to just giving out about the wait time. And in transportation generally, we have this issue with time because it's one of the complaints we constantly get of, I can't get there fast enough, or the train is delayed, or the bus got cancelled and I'm going to have to wait for another one, or the scooter is running out of battery and therefore I'm not going to get there on time. Time is huge in transportation. It's also, if you talk to anyone within a transportation organization, it's probably like KPI number one, on-time arrival. It's a huge thing. And what's interesting is we don't quite understand how people perceive time. So once we actually start to look into the neuropsychology, the brain workings around time, we feel that walking feels twice as long in terms of the time spent doing it as the time using other transportation modes. So it's one of the reasons why people dislike walking. They feel it's taken them twice as long to get there as if they were on the same time period. Half an hour on a bike seems like an hour walking, if you get my drift, even though you're only walking for half an hour. So walking tends to slow people down in that mode. But what's interesting is waiting for something to happen feels even slower than walking. So even if you're still getting to your destination at the same time, if you have to wait for 20 minutes and then the 10-minute bus gets you there in the same amount of time, it feels like it's taken an awful lot longer. People hate waiting. Calm ambience shrinks time. So if we can create things like nice lighting, relaxing music, lovely scenery, those kind of things, we view those things differently in our brain, and it suddenly doesn't seem as long. Travel on clean trains is perceived as the train was faster than on a dirty train. There are all these weird little things that are coming out in research, and I just find them really fascinating. So, and this one I thought was great as well. Passengers perceive return trips to be 22% faster than the trip to your destination in the first place. And that's the whole watch pot never boils thing. When you're really eager to get somewhere, that anticipation slows down time. But when you're just on the way back from it, you don't really care as much. So you're just paying less attention to the time and the clock and, you know, getting there on time and getting to see whoever you want to see or whatever it is. So when we talk about on-time arrival and stuff like that, time is really relative to the people who actually we think care deeply about that. And it means different things to different people. So where I'm going with this is the experience that we create around transportation is often just as important, if not more important, than the technical metrics that we may feel are the most important things around transportation and mobility. So, given all that, I want to conclude on the last few bits on the principles of behavioral science. And this is persuasion techniques. This actually came from an academic in the US called Robert Cialdini. He is pretty famous in the world of psychology because he was one of the first researchers to go out and do tests in the real world rather than in labs, which is where a lot of psychology had been done up until the 60s and into the 70s even. So he discovered some really interesting things about what influences people and how they get persuaded. And he has 6 key principles. And those are reciprocity. So if someone does something for us, we are much more likely to want to do something in return. There's a religious group in New York who've actually been banned from the train stations because they used to give out flowers to people coming off the train, and they would not ask for any money. But later at the exit, someone would be standing with a basket looking for charitable donations, and people would still feel obliged to give money because they had gotten the flower for free, supposedly. So they actually banned them from the New York train system because there was so many flowers outside the train stations that it was actually annoying for them to clean up. Commitment and consistency. Once people commit to something, they're more likely to follow through, to appear consistent. So Cialdini did research around asking people, did they feel that they were sustainable in their nature? And did they recycle at least as much, or if not more, than other people in the same area? And of course, everyone kind of goes, yeah, I do. And what they realized is once they just went around to houses and asked that question, the recycling in the area generally increased by about 20% because everyone wanted to appear consistent with what they had told this random person who had come to their door. So if someone sees themselves in a certain way, they want to continue with that consistency. Scarcity. People perceive scarce items as more valuable. If there's only a few left, you'll hear it in advertising for retail stores all the time. There's here in Ireland, a shop that has a campaign every weekend that says, when it's gone, it's gone. And the whole idea is creating this thing of it's not going to be there much longer. There's a famous thing in the Shopping Channel network where they used to say, our representatives are waiting for your call. And that created an image in people's heads of like people are sitting there twiddling their thumbs waiting for you to call in. And they changed that language to, if you don't get through on the first time, try again. And suddenly that changed the image of, oh my God, there's so many people calling in to buy this that I need to be part of that grouping, and there's obviously not going to be much left. And it created a whole different dimension around it. It also linked to another one that I'll talk about. Authority. We are much more likely to follow the lead of someone who is either an expert in an area or has a position of authority. You're much more likely to be influenced by your boss to do something, for example, than a subordinate. If a policeman comes up to you or a policewoman comes up to you and tells you to do something, you're much more likely to follow their lead than a normal person. So we are more influenced by authority. And then the last two, liking. We simply prefer to do things for people we like than people we dislike. And social proof. If we see that everyone else is doing something, we are much more likely to want to do it ourselves. So we are pack animals in that way. So there are different elements of this that I think are interesting in a transportation context. I know several of the partners within this group are looking at potentially doing some kind of awareness campaign or something like that into the future. And if you look at some of these principles, it's interesting to see how could we use some of these to understand how we communicate our message better. Do we have a poster with nothing but words on it? Or would people be more inclined to like a granny that's trying to send us a message, and a picture of a smiling person who reminds us of our own grandmother or something? So could likability come in there? Social proof. Do we show more than one person in these posters, or do we put in something around 75% of travelers take this option, would you like to too? So those kind of little bits can help you to just communicate your message a little bit better and encourage the behavior that you want. Okay, and I'm going to do the last little bit in terms of the spectrum of nudges that you can expect. Typically, there's 3 different categories, and it's passive to active. You are either telling people about the nudge that you are including them on, or you're making it entirely subliminal. Then you have generalized versus personalized. So is it the whole traveling population, or is it a certain segment? And then is it time-based or event-based? So is it one-off or is it consistent? And those tend to create different types of nudges in that context. So I'm conscious I've thrown a good bit of theory at you there. Are there any questions at this point before I go into some of the examples of how these have been used? Just double check the chat to make sure there's nothing in there. No. Cry is still the last word in there, which is probably not the best sign. Okay, super. So let's get on to the more exciting bits. And these I just think are some really interesting nudges that I have seen that I could distinctly see could change behavior. So this is a zebra crossing. It was first created, I believe this one is in the US, but it was first created in Iceland. And they decided to create 3D zebra crossings that create a different impression to the driver, that it actually looks like they're raised off the ground. And as you get closer, you realize they're not. But it would certainly make me slow down more in that context. It's been so successful that they have now moved it to India. And then you have these floating ones back in Iceland as well. So it's developed a whole range of different followers of different styles of these now. So creating stuff that are slightly different to the norm, I think is interesting. There was one other that I came across that actually has a picture of a little girl picking up a ball, and there's a sign at the side of the road saying, this could have been a real girl. I would be a little bit scared that people might think it's a real girl and swerve or something, and it's a little bit unsafe from that perspective. But these you just slow down a little bit more for, and it helps with traffic calming. This, I think, is fascinating. Copenhagen put little footsteps to lead you to bins. And on the streets that they did it, littering was reduced by 46%, just by putting these little footsteps towards the bins. So it just subliminally created a message of, it's not that far, go step over there and put your rubbish in the bin, as opposed to dropping it on the ground. I think it was a really subtle but beneficial piece of work in terms of nudging, creating a new environment, reframing thinking around that long walk all the way to the bin. Here's another one. How do we get people to use the stairs as opposed to the elevator? Why not turn it into a little bit of a game, make it look like a piano, and make it just more entertaining to go up and down the steps than it is to go up and down the elevator. This has been replicated in multiple different places around the world, and people are starting to do really cool things now beyond this. I think the stairs is the original. People are bringing it to the next step in terms of creating innovative patterns, lighting systems even that go across this so that they light up as you go up, a range of different things like that. And again, it's just create something that's a little bit more unique and innovative that engage people, and then they're probably more likely to take the smarter choice in terms of their benefit from that. This one comes from Copenhagen, and in Copenhagen they created what they call the Green Wave, and it is a 20-kilometer constant speedway where they guarantee green lights for bikes the whole way along if you stick to that 20 kilometers. So it's basically creating this whole shoot of, you get your all the way into town without having to stop at any red lights, which I think is really cool. I could see how this could be translated really nicely for kids going to school in the morning, for example. If we're talking about a school bus, a bike bus, I think it could be really interesting to bring this to actual buses. What if we had public transport running through on this? Cars would be massively envious when they see everyone in the bus flying past them all morning long through the traffic lights. I think it would be really fascinating from that perspective. So I really like this, and it's gone down really well in Copenhagen, and has been copied in multiple places since. And then this was a fascinating one, I thought, from Durham in North Carolina in the US. So they managed to decrease driving by 12% by sending personalized messages to people, mapping out what their commute should be if they were to use public transport, and then engaging them with this mayor's challenge, where the more they used public transport, the more times they were entered into what was a relatively small competition, in fact, or like a relatively small prize. But they gave this detail that just made the choices so much easier for people. And, you know, sometimes people don't even know where the bus goes to or which number they should take or those kind of things. And it just mapped it out. Now, Maureen had already engaged with the ecosystem. That's how they knew where she worked. She had told them that, and this was an email to her. But to the people who hadn't yet engaged, they used similar technologies and used a street-by-street drop of leaflets. And I guess everyone on the same street is probably going to use the same kind of transport options, but they tailored the address to personalize it in that way, and then still gave the relevant detail to them. So a 12% decrease in driving, I think, is really substantial. So I just thought that this was a fascinating campaign as well, how we can just make those small decisions a little bit easier, where people go, actually, why don't I take this once a week and see what it's like? And then maybe it's better than their driving commute and they go more often. Okay. One other one that I really like is Japanese trains, when they're coming into certain train stations, will play a different jingle. So you can kind of disconnect. You can play away on your phone. You can have a snooze. And when you hear the jingle associated with your particular stop, you know that's the point where you need to wake up and re-engage with your transportation cycle. So I just felt it was a really interesting mix of things. If cars have their new car smell, why couldn't trains have their jingle that engages people, and they know where they need to retune into their commute or their trip? So there's a variety of different things that can be used in different contexts. I am going to now quickly run through how we can create our own nudges, and then I'm going to give us a little bit of time to try one out and see how we do that as a group. So, relatively straightforward process. You should define as much as possible the problem that you're trying to solve before you ever go into the types of nudges that you go into. So you're really trying to dig into, here's the problem we're solving, and then we'll create and design the possible interventions that the nudge will give you. You then test it on a limited audience, evaluate that. So you would set your data and your KPIs, and then iterate and scale the solution if it deserves scaling. It may not work, that's fine. But this is the typical process. I think it's relatively straightforward in terms of URBACT methodology and how we would move forward with that. One thing I would suggest, though, due east, make it easy, simplify the message, provide clear next steps, and reduce friction costs. So friction costs are anything that makes it slightly annoying to engage with whatever you're proposing as an intervention. If I have to click multiple different boxes on a website, I'm not bothered with doing that kind of thing. So if you can use an API that gets detailed filled much faster, that works better. If I have to do multiple switches on public transport, that is harder. So if we can get smarter routes, that makes my life much easier. So anything you can do to make your nudge easy to implement, or easy for the user to implement, that's key. Make it attractive. And I'm not saying that it has to be positive, because some nudges are actually push people away from things. So could be seen as kind of anti-attractive in that way. But attractive in terms of really being clear on what is the policy goal that you're trying to reach with what you're trying to do, and be able to communicate why that's relevant, why you're making these changes, and what that means. I've added the sometimes make it formal and official, other times friendly and casual. So really understand your audience. If you are trying to create a change that's coming from a government department and you're using a very casual and friendly tone, if that's a letter going out to someone or something like that, it can confuse people and they make them feel perhaps like it's a scam, because that's not the kind of communication that they typically expect from a government department. So think about what's the audience and how you're going to be communicating with them to create the right tone. Make it social. definitely show that others are performing the desired behavior, find the right messenger that people link with. So, are there community groups, networks that have deep understanding of that particular location or that particular community? Use them to communicate your messages. And then the T in EAST is be timely. So really dig into what are the timelines that you're working to, how do you communicate those, and then how do you follow up afterwards in terms of the next steps. So the two things there are the process timeline and then the EAST, which is a nice way of kind of summarizing how I would suggest you approach it. I will put these out there as some ideas that I thought might be interesting. If, for example, you decided to target employers, you could do a variety of different nudges, like making every employer introduce parking fees. That will discourage people from driving into work. Get employers to buy annual travel tickets for their staff, but the more the staff use them, the cheaper those become for the employer. So the employer is actually motivated to push people towards public transport. Allow carbon credits to be used in return for people using less public transport going to the office. Scope 3 emissions reduce. An employer shared transport or carpooling, I think that's relatively common. Maybe incentivize employers to vary start times so that you're taking pressure off peak systems, peak times. And then maybe looking at new starters within a business. When someone makes a change in their life, it's the easiest time to create a new behavior within them. So if someone's joining a company, if you can work with the company to say, new starters during their onboarding process, we'd like to dig a little bit more into how they're going to get to work in this new office and create the new behavior immediately, rather than them settling back into their own ways of just taking a motor vehicle to work. And then you could do things like gamify trips to the office, teams competing against each other to show their average improvement in walking speeds, or who uses more public transport during the week, or those kind of things could create interesting competitions with relatively minor prizes. Pride is probably the biggest reward in those situations. So those were ones that just kind of came to me as potential examples. But I would like you now.
Hello.
Can you hear me? I had to leave for a second there.
No problem. They're all ending in 2 seconds anyway.
Okay, good. Because I would like to pose a question if I still have the chance.
Start now.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering about the continuity, like the permanent effects of the nudging. So for example, especially I have an example. One example that you gave spoke to my heart in the sense that the ones with the pedestrian crossing, we work with safety in school zones.
Right.
And my question was like this: I really see how that intervention, the 3D crossing, would slow people down. And then I was wondering, like, over time, if we do that in a school zone, it's the same people over and over. So soon enough, they'll learn that that's just a drawing. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things about traffic is you'll probably have one person in a row of cars that don't necessarily know. So they'll slow everyone else down just by the nature of it. But what you want is create a new feeling of the speed that you should be doing in that zone. And the hope is that that translates, that it's not the crossing necessarily anymore, that it's this is the pace that I need to go here, especially if you're doing that every day. That's kind of the focus. Okay, so I'm conscious we only have 2 minutes left, so I'm not going to go through what you created, but was there any challenges with that experience that you'd like to share with everyone? Or any questions that have come out of it in terms of how you approach a part of it?
Yeah,
It was,
Yes.
yeah, for us, it was just interesting to change the thoughts and ideas. And we discussed a little bit about our experience and got new ideas. So it was good talk. A little too short for us to make a plan, but
Yes.
at least to get some ideas. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was saying to Monica, we might look at the next TNM and see how we maybe translate that into something a little bit deeper and part of a wider communications plan. I will say one of the things that's coming back in the research is that it is hard to get feedback on just one or kind of meaningful impact on just one, and that as a package of nudging behaviors that are combined, they tend to work better. So what I would encourage you in terms of your own action plans now is looking at, if you're doing a communications plan, what are the several issues that you need to look at, and what are the several nudges that you could put together to test as a group, and start to look at individual metrics, but also joint metrics on behavior change around those. I would like to thank you all so much for coming. Monica, sorry, what were you going to say?
Jana
Oh,
is
Jana, yeah.
I was just going to say that it was very interesting, to talk to people. We were like 3 in our groups, and one of us couldn't speak, so she chatted with us. So it was pretty fun. But yeah, that was a great idea to do a reward for the employees for using walking or public transportation or bikes, and to take a day off as a reward for those who changed their means of transport to get to work. That was a pretty good idea. So I wrote it down, and then I have some kind of ideas for pilots. So thank you for that.
Nice.
And,
if you're more active getting to work, you're probably going to be a more productive employee as well. So there are benefits to the employer in multiple different ways.
And you made me think more to look at things more creatively. I've been through a workshop like a month ago, and it was about creative thinking and be more creative within your work, to look at things more in a creative kind of way. And I think that's the thing that people miss. They don't do that like this. We do technically what we are used to do and what we were taught to do, and this is completely another way of looking at things. So thank you for that.
Fantastic. Well, look, this was starting the process. Recognize that it was probably a lot of information coming at you relatively quickly. So we will be sharing the slides, and obviously the recording will be there. And yeah, I thank you all so much for your attention and engagement, and looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Monica.
I just wanted to talk from the Ozona side. Apart from being coordinator, I think the waiting times, it's something that it's a big problem. Not because they are very long, but the way we manage waiting times in our region, because people, it's not complaining about prices, but yeah, they have this feeling that the bus is not reliable. It's never coming, and perhaps it's much more dramatical than it really is because of all these we've been talking about. So
it's the uncertainty.
Reflection,
the uncertainty, the lack of information. That's the big thing.
So thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, everyone. I won't be joining you for the coordination meeting, so good luck with that. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Have an amazing summer.
I have put in the evaluation survey in the chat, so please help us by filling it. And we will upload the session in the YouTube. I will send you the link in a couple of days. Okay, thank you very much all for coming. Have a nice day.
Thank you very
much.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.